Great. We're live, Alexander. Hello, everybody. Hello, Alexander in London. How is life treating you, Alexander, with your new responsibilities? Everything okay?
Everything is absolutely great. It's absolutely fantastic. We're not getting much sleep. We have to do all the things one has to do with newborns at night, but one accepts that. That comes with the territory. We knew it in advance, and life is great.
Okay, that is great. Valies, thank you, Valies, for the $20 super chat. Thank you very much, Valies. Meganizia Shan comes in with a super chat as well. Wasn't Mick Jagger one of the original Illuminati? Naughty spelled. Naughty.
Absolutely. You know, I can remember that time because I first came to England, to Britain in the 60s. And I remember being here in 65. And of course, I was, of course, very little. But I can remember that the world divided into two tribes, young people at least, divided into two tribes. Those who supported the Beatles, who were really, the good, well brought up, well behaved kids, and then there were those who supported the Rolling Stones, who were the naughty children. And of course, that was the image that the Rolling Stones and Mick Jagger played out for all it was worth at the time. I have to say, I'm sorry to say, I was absolutely, as a little child, all about the Beatles, not about the Rolling Stones. But I do remember it all very well.
The Rolling Stones, what is it? Pleased to meet you. Hope you guess my name.
Oh, absolutely. Quite, yeah, absolutely. Well, quite.
Very fitting for today's times, isn't it?
Well indeed.
All right. Let's see. We have a new member as well. These are all the messages that came through before we go live. When these messages come through, Alexander, once we go live, for some reason you lose all the messages. I don't know why YouTube does that, but Robert is a new member as well to the community. So I screenshot all these messages. Let's see. We have a lot of people joining us from everywhere. We have Valies moderating. We have Spartan Warrior Queen. Good to have you here, Spartan Warrior Queen. We missed you. It's good for you to be back and helping us moderate. Thank you, Valies, for moderating as well. Thank you to everyone that is joining us. Thank you to everybody on the chat on Locals, Alexander. Alexander is putting out all kinds of great content on Locals. You did a live chat as well on Locals 2 days ago.
Absolutely.
Right? And you talked about...
this situation in Eastern Europe, Ukraine and all that. And of course, that's becoming, I should say, a regular thing now. I do usually on Wednesday. So far, always on Wednesday, but I'm not saying it will definitely always be on Wednesday, but that's usually midweek that you will find me doing a live stream on Locals. And I think it was absolutely great. I mean, that's what I think anyway. But and I think lots of people joined us. Some of the people who are here, but please, you're very welcome to join us on Locals, and you can join live streams there. And remember, you can post your own content on Locals if you become a member too. So you can, engage us in all kinds of ways, and the community on Locals also.
All right. We got the great Zariel is in the house moderating as well. Welcome, Zariel. Hope you're doing well. Alexander, we have people joining us from Brazil, from the U.S., Colorado, Denver. Awesome city. Let's see. We got Holland in the house, Wyoming, USA. Great to have you all here. Greece is in the house. Hello to everyone in Greece, and hola, Costa Rica. Good to have you here as well. Let's see. The UK, of course, South Korea, Maryland. I used to live in Maryland. Australia is in the house as well. Then Austria, Alexander. Austria is saying they're going to put in place more lockdowns. They're actually considering it, as is Holland, by the way. They're floating it around, but nothing definite.
No, nothing definite.
What do you think about that?
Well, it's coming. I think we're going to see more of those across Europe, actually, because one can already see the media commentaries leading up to this. I was reading an article in The Guardian, by the way, just before we started. I mean, I have to read the British media. It's part of my job. So that's why I read The Guardian. I wouldn't probably otherwise, but I did. And they're talking about the prospects of more such things in the United States too. So just think about that, because, well, also all the usual explanations are given. I don't have to go into that, but I think it's quite likely.
We said it would happen. We said it
Yeah,
would get
absolutely,
a lot worse before it got a lot better.
yeah,
And it looks
yeah,
like we're heading towards that. But let's hope not. Let's
exactly,
hope it doesn't
exactly,
go that
exactly.
way. And let's hope that our prediction in this instance is wrong.
Well, indeed. But I'm pretty confident of it, I'm sorry to say. That's the truth.
Well, yeah. We'll see what happens. Hello to everyone in Serbia. I hope everyone's doing well in Serbia. And hello to all our friends in Ireland as well. Alexander, let's talk about, I think we have to talk about Ukraine, Russia, perhaps U.S. troops and weapons going to Ukraine. I think we definitely have to touch upon, of course, the border crisis between Belarus and Poland. But maybe we should talk about another border crisis, maybe a real border crisis, which is an article that you sent me about 5-10 minutes before we went live, which is the border crisis with the UK and France. I wonder if this is why Macron is very quiet about what's going on in Belarus and Poland, because he doesn't want to draw attention to perhaps a hybrid war that's being launched against the UK. I mean, isn't it interesting that Lukashenko is launching a hybrid war, but no one is talking about the hybrid war being placed against the United Kingdom? That's kind of interesting, isn't it?
Absolutely, because of course, whilst the world headlines scream about the situation on the Polish-Belarus border, whilst the Security Council of the United Nations meet, whilst the Western powers issue statements saying that Belarus is single-handedly trying to destabilize the entire European Union and the West, whilst all of that is going on, and whilst not a single migrant has actually crossed into the Polish border so far, on Thursday, yesterday, in other words, 1,000 migrants crossed the British Channel from France into the United Kingdom. And we've had 20,000 migrants coming to the United Kingdom from France this year. The numbers apparently are increasing. And of course, nobody's talking about this. Compare that, 1,000 in one day yesterday from France into Britain. Total number of migrants trying to cross into the European Union from Belarus at the moment is said to be 4,000. Compare that with 1,000 on just one single day from France into Britain. The one attracts no attention, the other attracts vast attention. But you can ask yourself this question. I mean, if Belarus is trying to destabilize the European Union by allowing migrants to travel into the European Union from Belarus's territory, then presumably France and President Macron are trying to destabilize Britain and are doing it much more successfully.
Are they?
Well, because far more people are crossing it.
Are they?
Well, I think, actually, I'm going to say this. I don't think that Macron is trying to destabilize Britain exactly, but he's certainly putting pressure on the Johnson government. He's in a massive row with Johnson. He clearly feels very angry with Johnson about many things, about the AUKUS deal, the nuclear submarine deal. He feels that Brexit hasn't turned out quite as he'd expected, all of those sort of things. So I think that he is using the migrant issue to some extent to put pressure on the British, and to put pressure on the British on a host of different things, on Northern Ireland, on fishing rights, on power exchanges. I mean, he's even talked about cutting off power to the Channel Islands, to these little territories to the south of Britain, between Britain and France, which are not technically part of Britain, but which form part of the British Isles, and of which the Queen is the sovereign. Anyway, he's doing all of these things. And of course, Lukashenko says, we'll cut off power supplies to the European Union. Everybody says, this is appalling. This is blackmail. This is extortion. Macron says, I'm going to cut off power supplies to the British Channel Islands. Well, this is very bad. This is basically a matter between Britain and France. I mean, it's really quite fascinating.
Such hypocrisy.
It is. It's absolutely yes. Now,
so real quick. The migrants from. Yeah, go ahead.
I'm not defending Macron here. I mean, I want to make that absolutely clear. What I'm saying is, You report one in one style, you report the other in a completely different style. I think it's entirely proper for people like me and us on the Duran to make those contrasts.
Right. So when they come, just so we know the rules of the game, when they go from France to the UK, then it's a good thing. When they go from Belarus to Poland, on their way to Germany, because they don't want to hang out in Poland. Let's be clear. They want to go to Germany. Then it's a bad thing. Just so we understand the rules. When they go to Hungary, when they want to go to Hungary, or when Orban says don't come in, then Orban's the bad guy. I mean, just so we understand exactly what the rules of this EU migrant game are. By the way, Orban was in Ankara and he met with Erdogan. What are your thoughts on that? And real quick, before I forget, Alexander, big thank you to Felix Rex, to Black Pigeon Speaks, for hosting us yesterday. Big thanks to Coach Red Pill as well for inviting us yesterday to that live stream. Check out their channel, Black Pigeon Speaks, and check out Coach Red Pill CRP as well. Thank you for hosting us yesterday. It was a really, really good live stream. Anyway, Alexander, I just wanted to say that they were incredible hosts, very generous and kind, and very knowledgeable as well. So definitely check out their channels on YouTube, BitChute, Telegram. They're pretty much everywhere as well. Orban in Ankara, that's interesting.
Well, absolutely. And you see, he's doing the right thing, because he's actually doing what one should do in these situations, because, of course, the place where most of these migrants are coming from is not Belarus. I mean, they're transiting through Belarus, but many of them ultimately come from the Middle East, and the place that's the major receptacle, the reservoir for these people, if you like, where there are millions of them, by the way, is Turkey. So he does what, of course, the European Union won't do. They won't talk to Lukashenko. They're not very happy about talking with Erdogan. Orban goes and talks to Erdogan. And by the way, we've had some news there, because what we've learned is that Turkish Airlines has now said that it will stop flying migrants from Turkey to Belarus. That was, and to be clear, it seems more of them came on Turkish Airlines than on Belt Air, the Belarusian national airline, which, by the way, has also said it is going to stop accepting people with Iraqi and Syrian and such passports, or certainly who want to travel to Belarus. So diplomacy works. It actually achieves things. You do it in a civil way. My own personal view is that this whole affair on the border between Belarus and Poland is basically a piece of theatre. I've become incredibly cynical about this. I don't think it has any reality. I just heard someone on my door, and I have to just deal with this. I won't be a moment.
Go ahead. I'll make a comment on Orban. I'll repeat it when Alexander comes back. I'll make a comment on Orban going to Turkey. Wow, those dogs are loud. Look, Orban, my hunch is that he went to speak with Erdogan, perhaps on Poland's urging. That's my guess there. And I also think that Poland and Hungary, because they're allied together and they're coordinating, I bet you they wanted to show Ursula von der Leyen and the EU how diplomacy is done, because the EU refuses to speak to Erdogan. Obviously, they refuse to speak to Lukashenko. They're trying to put all the blame on Russia. So my hunch is that Poland and Hungary, they called each other and they said, you know what, Orban, why don't you go talk to Erdogan about this? And Orban went there. He spoke with Erdogan, and he's kind of solving the problem. It also shows that Turkey was indeed the country that was flying a lot of the migrants into Belarus. I think that points to the fact that they were coming on Turkish flights into Belarus. So I think that meeting between Orban and Erdogan in Ankara kind of sheds a lot of light as to what was going on with this border crisis between Poland and Belarus. So that's just my hunch there. I'll repeat that to Alexander and see what he thinks. But Alexander, real quick, I was just saying in the stream, my hunch is that Orban, Poland and Hungary which are allied together and they are coordinating.
Mm-hmm.
I bet you Poland, at the urging of Orban, at the urging of Poland, went to see Erdogan, because I bet you Poland was like, as you're making this trip to Turkey, because this was probably planned weeks or months in advance, but they said, as you're going to Turkey, talk to Erdogan about these migrants flying from Turkey to Belarus. One, it helps solve the real problem, because you're talking to the actual source of the problem. And number two, you make van der Leyen and EU look very stupid, because they refuse to speak to Erdogan. They refuse to speak to Lukashenko. And here you have Orban going to Turkey and actually conducting diplomacy. It makes the EU look very stupid. It shows that Orban is solving the problem. He's a problem solver. And I think he actually went there because not only because he has stuff he wants to deal with regards to Turkey, but I bet you that Poland was like, we can't go there, but since you're going to go down there, go there and solve this issue.
I think that's exactly what happened, because it seems to me that it's very interesting to see how the moment Orban touches foot places, goes to Turkey, real action happens to bring this situation under control. And I think that's entirely likely. I think, in fact, it's not just the Poles. They've been talking to the Hungarians, not just the Polish government talking to Orban. I'm pretty sure Orban has been giving advice to the Poles also, because the Poles, to be very clear about this, have overplayed their hand also. That some of the media commentary amongst the liberal soft underbelly of the European Union and in Britain is now turning against Poland. And this is because, of course, a lot of these people who we're talking about, they instinctively side with migrants in this sort of crisis. So pictures of Polish troops and tanks being deployed on the border and border fences being built up, that is a little bit too reminiscent for some people in the West. I'm talking about, as I said, the liberal soft underbelly of what Donald Trump was doing in the United States, and then some, because, of course, he never deployed tanks to the border in that kind of way. So I'm starting to see critical comments about Poland starting to appear. There was an interesting article in the Financial Times. There's been an editorial in The Guardian, all the usual suspects as well. Now, Orban needs Poland to remain stable and on side with him, because if the Polish government falls, and it's in a much more precarious position than his is, then he becomes isolated in the European Union, and comes a point where he could find himself deprived of voting rights on the European Council. So I think what he is doing, and I think the Poles and the Hungarians have been talking to each other, they've been exchanging ideas and messages. The Poles say, help us with Turkey. Orban says, we will do that. We want you to try and start de-escalating the situation. And I think that's probably explains why we've seen Orban go to Turkey. I'm not, obviously, as you said, it was scheduled. But Orban, interestingly, has maintained a good relationship with Erdogan. Bear in mind that this is something that is... Because
he's not an ideologue.
He's not an ideologue. The thing about Orban is, of course, he defends Hungarian sovereignty, he defends Hungarian national interests, but he doesn't bear historic grudges. And this is where he's, in my opinion, superior to the Poles. Hungary had a difficult relationship with Russia, not just during the Soviet occupation. If there's any Hungarians, for example, watching this program, they will know that way back in 1848, this is an important event in Hungarian history, the Russian army entered Hungary, smashed a rebellion, a national uprising that was going on, led by Leo Kossuth against the Habsburgs. The Russians went in and defeated it, crushed it to help the Habsburgs, with whom they were then allies. So it's a major event in Hungarian history. So the Hungarians have long historic grievances against Russia. Orban puts all that to one side. Hungary has massive historical grievances against Turkey. Turkey was the occupying power in Hungary for centuries. And yet he puts all that to one side also, because he says, I am defending Hungary's interests now. I don't carry around grievances. I consider what Hungary needs today, and I do what must be done. And that's what he's done.
What does Boris Johnson need to do to stop the inflow into the UK?
Oh, well, it's very simple. He needs to round up these people and send them back. That's the best thing he needs to do. Put them back on
to France.
Absolutely, send them back to France. And perhaps he should follow. I mean, I will say this to the Poles. I mean, I think they've overreacted, but I want to make it very clear. I don't think they should just accept people. I mean, that's absurd. But what the Poles have at least managed by talking up this issue is that they rallied, to some extent at least, the collective West behind them. And we're getting complaints taken to the Security Council of the United Nations and debates there and things of that kind. The British need to raise an absolute stink about this. They need to complain. They need to take it to international institutions. They need to do all the sort of things that, for any number of different reasons, the British political class is unwilling to do. The reason they're unwilling to do it is because the British political establishment still hankers for a close relationship with Europe, and they still hanker for a close relationship with France. And there's all those strategic concerns. In fact, what they need to do is to start asserting their position strongly in the way that Hungary and Poland do.
Yeah. From JHW, Alexander's thoughts on Meghan Markle committing perjury. And if she faces no sanction, can we say that the rule of law is completely dead in England?
Well, I would actually like you to, we're talking about Black Pigeon and the program we did there, because I've actually there was a discussion about this very topic there, not about Meghan Markle, who, to be straightforward about, is somebody I'm not particularly follow. But the fact that we now have very selective application of the law across the West, and in places in Britain, in the United States, everywhere now. So sometimes some people are prosecuted or sued and others are not. And the law ought to apply equally to everybody. If it doesn't, it is no longer law. It becomes an arbitrary tool used by those in power to go after some people and not others. And when that happens on a systematic basis, as is increasingly happening, then I'm afraid it's absolutely true that the rule of law has broken down, because it's no longer the law that is ultimately the deciding factor. It is those who control law who are deciding things. So without getting into the details of the Meghan Markle affair, which, as I said, doesn't particularly interest me because I'm not particularly interested in her, just without getting into the details of it, we are seeing far too much of this going on all the time, and that's the problem.
Yeah. Mark Hewitt says Bojo could destroy Macron by taking away equivalents from French financial firms.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is, I agree. I mean, countries like Britain in this sort of thing pull their punches. I mean, can I just talk about, a leader who didn't pull his punches? And de Gaulle. I mean, de Gaulle, who was, asserting French sovereignty in a particular way. He didn't pull his punches. If he'd been treated in the kind of way that Britain has been treated, he would have used every instrument available to France in order to assert and defend France's positions. I strongly suspect that earlier generations of British leaders, Churchill, Clement Attlee, Margaret Thatcher, would have done exactly the same thing. Nowadays, we have this paralysis, this weakness, and of course, on top of everything else, because there's been a series of political scandals in Britain connected to corruption issues, we've just done a short video on this, which has either appeared or will shortly appear on the Duran.
Shortly.
Yeah, shortly. There's been a series of political scandals in Britain. Johnson, who looked stronger a few weeks ago, is now looking weaker again and is apparently very distracted by those scandals at the moment. shut my door remote. No, we seem all right.
It's up to you.
No, yeah, we seem all right. We seem all right.
All right.
Let me just let me.
You want to shut your door? Okay.
Yes, I think so.
All right.
We have. Okay. We have a visit.
Yeah, I can see the. I don't know if that's Mishkin. I don't know which dog that is in the background.
That is indeed Mishkin. Yeah.
Okay.
Who is a very.
He wanted to come in, not to.
No, he's here. That's the other dog you're hearing.
Ah, okay.
I have two.
Yes. Okay. All right. Let's see. Let's get back to some questions, some chats here. Pete says, couldn't find a way to donate to the chat from locals. Thank you, Pete, for your donation here. Actually, locals, you have a tipping jar, I believe, underneath the video. But thank you very much, Pete, for your super chat. And Zariel says, I actually believe a neutral Poland would be a good thing. Take out NATO, EU, and Russia pressure. It would be smart, and they'd start a sovereign diplomacy.
Zariel, you are so right. You are profoundly and completely right. And can I just say something? I think one day, because I know Poland reasonably well, by the way, at least, and I know lots of Polish people, I think it will happen. There's a lot of issues, a lot of historic issues, a lot of grievances. It's important to remember that Kaczynski, who is the leader of the Law and Justice Party, who's a very skillful and clever politician in some ways, but he's also got issues with Russia because he's convinced himself entirely wrongly that the Russians murdered his brother, which is complete nonsense. I mean, that the Russians organized that air crash on the way to Katyn. So he's got this obsession with Russia, and I'm afraid there's far too many people in Poland who still share it. But one day, I have no doubt at all, because far from all Poles feel like this. Many Poles, on the contrary, are unhappy with this kind of style of politics. I am sure it will come. And when it comes, when that reconciliation between Poland and Russia comes, it will be a tremendous source of stabilization in Eastern and Central Europe. In fact, it'll be the single most important event in Eastern and Central European history. It will mean that all of these various crises that we see, all this agitation that we're getting from the Neocons and all of that, that will finally end, because they can only do it if Poland is on side with them. And Poland and Russia have so much in common now, have so many things which they could work together so successfully with. And Poles and Russians, and I've seen this myself, get on so well with each other at a personal level. They're both Slavs, they're both Slav peoples. They have lots of cultural, lots of aspects of culture in common. Not everything. There's massive amount of cultural interchange. Polish actors act in Russian films, for example. Russian actors act in Polish films. In fact, people don't widely know. Lots of cultural interchange that goes on between these two countries. So they are natural friends if they can get all this history behind them. And NATO isn't helping to protect Poland because Russia has no aggressive intent.
That's not what NATO is.
But it is NATO, on the contrary, that is creating problems between Poland and Russia. It is NATO and the Neocons who run it, who have their own agendas, who are creating all of these tensions. If NATO went away, to be straightforward about it, if the European Union went away, these two countries would find each other. And as I said, it would be a partnership that would do an enormous amount of good, both for them and for peace in Europe overall.
Yeah, I agree with that. Simon says the UK must leave the UN Refugee Convention and repeal the Human Rights Act. Both have become a national suicide pact. Discuss.
Right. Well, once upon a time, because I was never a human rights lawyer. And in fact, to be straightforward about it, having had many interactions with the British human rights legal community, I was frankly extremely unimpressed by them. And I'm not going to say more. I'm not going to get it personal now. But I used to be somebody who thought that joining the Human Rights Act was a good thing. I don't think so anymore. I think we should leave it behind. And I think, Simon, I'm on your side with this, to be straightforward about it. I think high time Britain decided to make its own decisions. I'm sure we could do them better in a humane and wise way. And I think we would be much better off doing exactly the things that you've said. Here, I've changed my views. They didn't used to be this way. I'm afraid I've come round to your thinking.
Yeah. Flying Boris says Poland needed good ties with Russia because deteriorating relationship with the EU and hostilities towards Russia won't help them.
You're completely right. And can I just say, Alex,
agreeing with what you said.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, but it's also what you said some weeks ago, Alex. I mean, that this obsession, this phobia of Russia, which, as I said, far from all Poles have, by the way. I mean, and that needs to be reiterated. It clouds them. It clouds their judgment. It robs them of clarity. They don't see where their real problems now are coming from. Now, there was a time in the 90s and the early 2000s when Poland being part of the EU was really good for Poland. I'm not denying it. I mean, Poland was one of those countries that actually benefited from EU membership. But that's increasingly exhausting itself now. It's becoming increasingly difficult to see that this relationship with the EU is going well or is attractive any longer for Poland. And I understand that despite the fact that there's still a lot of support for the EU in Poland, there is now increasing criticism of the EU, including, interestingly, from some of the sort of remnant parties or people in Poland who define themselves as left. So this isn't just a right-wing nationalist populist thing that the media is starting always talking about. There are even some left-wing Poles who are starting to say to themselves, the EU just isn't working for us, isn't working for Poland anymore. It's coming along, it's interfering in our affairs in a very bad way and is creating problems for us, which we simply don't need, because it's this EU centre imposing its ideas upon us. So perhaps step by step, they need to start pulling away, and they need to start considering whether the EU that exists today, with its exemplary genius leadership of Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel and people like that, and Josep Borrell and people like that, whether the EU there is today is the same EU that they joined back in the 90s.
Yeah. Sidebook VR says globalists think they are Senate of Rome. China and Russia are just large barbarian kingdoms. China thinks it's the Ming Dynasty, and globalists are a bunch of small kingdoms.
That's so true. You put it so well. You put it so well. Actually, I mean, you've also got the Chinese pretty right. I read the Chinese media now regularly because I find it quite interesting and absorbing, actually, because I mean, obviously it's intensely controlled, but within that you get a very interesting insight into the sort of Chinese mind. And I think you're quite right. As I said, I mean, they see the outside, the West, as these foreign barbarians, and of course the Americans, or at least the EU or the globalist elite, as you said, they imagine themselves the Roman Senate. It's wrong on both counts, by the way. I mean, they don't really understand each other very well, but we live under the rule of the Senate, if we could put it like that, here where we are.
Yeah, so make it easy. Ashad says, yeah,
perhaps that's what we need to be more concerned about. Carry on.
Correct. Make it easy. Ashad says, trying to dismantle an Egyptian legacy, it's like facing the mother of man herself. Best regards. Have very much enjoyed sitting under the tree with the Duran. Thank you very much. Make it easy, Ashad, for that. And let's see, where are we here? Flying Boar says, Polish politicians, Sikorsky, husband of Anne Applebaum, yes. So-called liberal, very anti-Russian. Yeah, I mean, the ties towards the Ukraine Maidan, the coup in Ukraine, also kind of go through Poland as well.
Absolutely. I just have to, I'm sorry, I think this will be the last moment, actually, but it's something I just quickly have to do.
All right. Let's go through some more of these super chats here. Rifi says Stella and Julian Assange can now get married. Yes, I read that today as well. That is some good news because it gives Assange some hope that he needs. Positive energy.
This is the marriage. This is the marriage in Belmarsh. It is actually excellent news. It is excellent news because, of course, it is the first humane and rational decision that's been made over the course of his case. It also shows that bringing a legal challenge, which is what Assange did to achieve it, has actually had some effect. And given that there's actually constant communication between the court and the government. I know because once upon a time, long ago, I was part of that information exchange between the court and the government that used to happen. It suggests that opinion in the court is starting to harden in Assange's favor. So the government was worried that it might lose this decision, this case that Assange was bringing in order to let himself get to marry. And that might be a sign of things to come when the High Court makes its decision on the appeal, the extradition appeal, which we're now looking forward to in January. So it suggests, we can't bank this, it's speculative what I'm saying at the moment. I've no inside knowledge, I should say, but it suggests that the legal wind is starting to turn in his favor, which is a good sign.
Yeah. Ken Barber says, Sympathy for the Devil, the Rolling Stones cites established historical events. It begins by acknowledging the cross of Jesus Christ. What do you think?
Well,
the song is the song is Satan moving through historical events. I mean,
absolutely, yeah. I'm sorry. I mean, you know, obviously it has its social, which is subversive side, but I mean, it's intelligent, and it was. The Rolling Stones were an intelligent force, if I can remember, if I can say. And yes, I mean, I understand the point. One of the points about the Rolling Stones, and you know, we're talking about crosses and things of this kind, is that the British authorities in the 60s didn't like the Rolling Stones very much, and they tried to prosecute them on, well, basically smoking things. And the Times published a very famous editorial, which was all about don't crucify a butterfly. In other words, you know, don't worry about the fact that, you know, these people come up with these little things. This isn't something you should take entirely seriously. You should have a relaxed view about it. So this is, you know, about crucifixions and all of that sort of thing. And, you know, if only there were the same sort of common sense, because that editorial written by a rigidly conservative newspaper as it then was, if only that kind of common sense applied today, if there was that sense of humor, that willingness to accept different opinions, this understanding that, you know, people had to speak and talk. What we get today, on the contrary, is imposition of ideas, censorship of things that aren't acceptable, and things of that kind. So, you know, I'm not somebody who particularly likes that song, but you know, that's their business. I'm with the world of the Times in the 60s.
Here's an interesting comment. I stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw it was a time for a change. Yes, absolutely. That's one of the lyrics. But Sympathy for the Devil is based on Master and Margarita.
Well, I wouldn't know. I never made that connection. I think that's rather unlikely, actually. Master and Margarita came out in English. Well, it came out in Russian, I should say first, in 1966. And it was published, I'd have to check the times, the dates, actually. But I think it's too early for this. I might be wrong.
May have been a jumping off point.
It might have been a jumping off point.
I mean, I could definitely see the parallels.
Yeah. I should say that Master Margarita is a profoundly Christian book, if you've read it. It's very much written by a man who is a devout, or at least a very strong believer. Now, it's got some very interesting ideas, some ideas which perhaps the church might not entirely agree with or be entirely in accordance with, but the religious aspects of the novel are often overlooked by those who read them. It's primarily, by the way, a novel about the terror. It was written during the terror by a Christian Russian writer who'd fought for the whites, but who was able to function in Moscow because he had the personal protection of no less a person than Joseph Stalin himself. But he was deeply concerned and obviously worried about what was happening. And it's an illusory novel. It's operating at many philosophical levels, but it's basically about the terror and about the nature of the terror in Russia. And if you understand that and you read the novel, you will see all the various allusions and how they build up and come together. It was first published in Russia in 1966 in a first edition, which omitted some of the more controversial passages. Then the Soviet authorities let it be published in complete version in 1972. And it's 1972 that I think people in the West, the 1972 version, that is the one that people know about in the West.
Yeah, cited as one of the greatest novels in history. I mean,
I think so.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an extraordinarily brilliant novel, actually. And by the way, there's a very, very fine Russian television adaptation. Better than the feature film, which was produced in chaotic circumstances in the 1990s. But the television adaptation is exceptional. Yeah. If you can find it. You can get the DVD somewhere. And I think you can also get it on YouTube, by the way.
Yeah, I'm sure it's somewhere on the interwebs. Kevin Dorr says, did you see the GOP congressman on Tucker trying to talk up war with Russia in the Ukraine? What a joke. We need to clean out the GOP from these folks. Actually, Alexander, I have a video on that, where I do a reaction video to that segment on Tucker Carlson. He had a congressman on, and the congressman was basically pushing for U.S. troops and arms, lethal weapons, to go to Ukraine, because we all know that Russia is, amassing on the border, and they're going to invade any minute now. And he was drawing parallels between Biden's failure in Afghanistan, saying we can't have a second debacle in Ukraine. He also said during that interview, Alexander, that it's strategically important to come to the aid of Ukraine, because Tucker Carlson was asking all kinds of questions like, why should we care? What about securing our border first instead of sending troops to Ukraine? And Tucker Carlson also said, shouldn't we be on the side of Russia? I mean, after all, Russia is the counterbalance to China, and China is our main adversary. So it doesn't make any sense that we would be hostile to Russia. But anyway, this guy said that this congressman from Ohio said, well, it's strategically important to protect Ukraine because we have countries like Turkey, like Romania, and like Greece, which border the Black Sea. And we have to protect the Black Sea. And I was just like, I think Greece has not bordered the Black Sea for hundreds and hundreds of years. So, I mean, the guy, they don't know what they're talking about.
It's utterly demented stuff. It's schoolboy geopolitics. It's people who play. There used to be a board game called Diplomacy, which some people may remember. I think it still exists. You can still find it somewhere. It's people who think that international relations is conducted in that kind of way. It's childish and stupid stuff. And can I just say, the absolute way to guarantee that there's going to be a war in Ukraine is to do what this person talks about. All this pressure on Belarus that we were talking about, the migrant crisis there. What has it done? I just looked at the news feed this morning. I looked at TASS. I find that Russian troops are now in Ukraine. The Russians have just flown in airborne units. Not into Ukraine, into Belarus. They've just flown in airborne units into Belarus to carry out joint drills with the Belarusian military this morning. So that's one thing. And of course, we've had overflights yesterday and the day before by advanced Russian bombers. Tupolev bombers have been overflying Belarus to protect Belarus. And the Russians are quite openly saying this is a response to NATO moves. Now, imagine what the response will be if you actually have US troops sent to Ukraine. Even more sensitive issue. The Russian media at the moment is full of stories about US ships in the Black Sea and how dangerous and destabilizing those are. I mean, that is really touching on Russian sensitivities. So do what this person says. He's got his geopolitics completely wrong. Start a war in Ukraine. You lose your war in Ukraine because everybody who studied this accepts that in this part of the world, they will lose a war in Ukraine. And then, believe me, once that debacle happens, well, you can forget about Turkey, Greece, and all the others, because if the United States is defeated in Ukraine, and it would be in some form, then frankly, at that point, all those pieces that he's talking about will fall. Now, Turkey was on NATO's side during the period of the Cold War, when, of course, we had the Soviet Union, which incorporated Ukraine. This issue, this thing that he's talking about is absolute nonsense. Countries like Turkey will absolutely not make any kind of calculations based on the kind of stupid reasoning this congressman came up with. Who was he, by the way, if I could ask?
Oh God, like a nobody, Turn or something.
Okay,
I don't know. He wasn't like one of the big, one of the big guys, but he was actually on the arms intelligence, arms service and intelligence committee. So he was also trying to shill for the military industrial complex.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, it looks like somebody out to gain some kind of attention. But of course, words have consequences. If people in the House of Representatives are talking in this kind of way, if congressmen are trying to talk, it has an effect on decision making.
Mike Turner.
It obviously has. So stupid geopolitics, stupid policies altogether, far more likely to provoke the very response that he imagines it's going to deter. It just shows, to be straightforward about it, how reckless and ignorant these people are.
Yeah, thank you very much, Doug, for that, Mike Turner. Yeah, Tucker gets it. Tucker gets it, and he pretty much just made the guy look foolish. He's talking about protecting the borders of Ukraine, and Tucker was like, "Why, when we have millions of people flooding the borders, coming into the U.S.?" And he even said, "I haven't heard you calling for troops to go to the southern border." He's like, "How come you don't call for troops to go to the southern border?" And he was just the congressman was just kind of like, he couldn't answer it.
Well, of course, I mean, and of course, the point about China is an entirely valid one. I mean, who actually decides to bring a two-front war on themselves? I mean, it seems geostrategically nonsensical. I mean, it's absurd.
It was the first time I believe I've heard a mainstream American TV host, especially the size of Tucker Carlson, the #1 host, actually say, "You know what? We should be siding with Russia." That was his point. He said, "We should be aligning with Russia and not with Ukraine because China is our main adversary, so it makes zero sense." The first time I've heard it.
Well, he's absolutely right. I mean, I wish these ideas had been circulating 10, 15 years ago when, they might have had a real effect, but it's still not too late to at least slow this process of Russian-Chinese integration, or at least if not slow it, to sort of change it into different directions. The Russians did not want to get into an over-close alliance with China because they know that in such an alliance, China is dominant. And I suspect that, again, if you start to talk to the Russians, reason with them, accept that they have red lines, they would start, I don't say they'd break their connection with China, but they would start to distance themselves to some extent. But just as putting all that pressure on Belarus, all it's doing is resulting in Belarus integrating with Russia and now hosting Russian troops and asking for Russian bombers to overfly its territory. So putting pressure on Russia inevitably pushes Russia into closer alliance with Beijing. How does that make any kind of sense? And if you do end up in a two-front war, in Ukraine and Taiwan at the same time, well, God help you. And future historians, future writers will ask, and they will want to know what kind of strategic thinkers got the United States into that mess.
Yeah. Peter says, hello from the UK. Peace and love to all. Thank you very much, Peter, for that. And Kurt, hello, Kurt. How you doing? Says, why did the Polish PM blame the Russians for the plane crash which killed his brother?
Well, good question. I suspect because if I suspect there are psychological things. I mean, at one level, he didn't want to accept the report that came out, which appeared to suggest that his brother, who was interfering or who might have been interfering with the decisions that the pilots were making, might have been partly responsible. And it's entirely understandable at a human level that the Polish PM just wouldn't accept that his brother, was responsible and would want to defend his brother's reputation. That is one reason. The second is that Kaczynski, to give him his name, has a visceral feeling about Russia, which of course predates this. He was already predisposed to be antagonistic to Russia. So this, in effect, reinforced his suspicions. So he's concerned about the reputation of his brother. He's already predisposed to dislike Russia. And I think once he got into this treadmill of trying to prove to the world that, in fact, it was the Russians who killed his brother, well, you can only do that by persuading himself that that is true. Now, it's a very interesting situation because the Russians have been accused by, the United States, by Britain, by all kinds of countries of killing all kinds of people. But even the Americans and the British have, never said that the Russians actually killed Kaczynski's brother, who was, of course, at the time the president of Poland. They've never been blamed by the West for that, because to be straightforward about it, the evidence on this one is overwhelming, and it was clearly an accident.
Yeah, I agree. Flying Boar says, Polish politicians, Sikorski, husband of Anne Applebaum, so-called liberals. They are so-called liberals.
Well, they are exactly that. They're not neoliberals. I mean,
they're not. They're neoliberals.
They're neoliberals. They're neoliberals, or in their case, they're definitely on the neoliberal side of the neocon neoliberal, picture. But I mean, let's not exaggerate the difference. I mean, neoliberals and neocons are just essentially the same. It's that one pretends to be left and the one pretends to be right. Neocons are not conservatives. Let's be quite clear about that. There's nothing that connects neocons with conservatism. They are the absolute opposite of true conservatism. And if you're talking about neoliberalism and liberalism, well, the classical liberalism of Voltaire and J.S. Mill and people like that is very different from what neoliberals preach.
Yeah. Simon says Hampshire police are investigating a hate crime in Basingstoke. A poster saying it's okay to be white. What better way to turn a country fascist?
Well, indeed, absolutely. I mean, it's just stupid. I mean, this is ludicrous business. As I said, the old British establishment, Christian but self-confident, and could accept the Rolling Stones, a Rolling Stones song, which some of them found offensive. The present neoliberal establishment won't tolerate anything. They'll clamp down on everybody. They'll exacerbate everything. They'll create tensions. They'll make people angry. And there you are. And I mean, and Britain is far less bad in this than the United States is. Let's be straightforward about it. And less bad than France also is, by the way.
Yeah, but Britain is trying to get to where the US is. There's no doubt about it.
And it's moving in that direction at an ever faster speed. We're not quite as bad, but we'll get there before very long.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, let's see. Irish Partisan says Poland needs to break free of NATO, US, EU cabal, but the problem is they won't. Many are still stuck in the Russia is bad camp, even many nationalists.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and of course, there's a particular nationalist wing which is especially anti-Russian. But my own personal view, and as I know lots of Poles, I think it is shifting in Poland. And I think it's more likely to change there and change fast and suddenly than it is in some other places. You could see a radical change come very suddenly and sooner than you think. And I'm not quite as pessimistic about this. The political class in Poland, the dominant parties, are hopeless about this kind of thing. I mean, whilst Kaczynski remains, the major power within the Law and Justice Party, obviously movement from that point of view is impossible. There are other people in the Law and Justice Party, maybe lower down in the system, who might have different views, but the rest of the leadership follows where Kaczynski leads them. The other big party, the Civic Platform, the Radek Sikorski's party, well, they're the real neoliberal EU integrationist party par excellence. They're not going to change. So the political establishment is not going to change. But further down the system, there are people who are beginning to, as I said, question this. And Polish society overall, as I said, is being closer to Russia, not just geographically, but also culturally. I think that there you start to see shifts. Lots of Poles, for example, live and work in Russia, and they communicate and they move around and they go over to Russia and they come back to Poland and they come back and they have families there and they have friends there. There's a much bigger interchange and intermovement between these two countries than there would be between Britain and Russia, say, or France and Russia, say. And not only that, because these are both Slav nations, when they move and talk with each other, they understand each other. So I wouldn't say that this is hopeless. I think it probably will happen one day, and I think it will happen. When it does happen, it will happen fast and it will happen suddenly, but it won't happen yet. On that I completely agree. We're looking at least 5, probably 10 years before we see any kind of movement at all.
The EU has to go for any. NATO, obviously, but the EU has to dissolve for any type of rapprochement with Russia. I mean, just on the visa side, on personal level, Alexander, on the visa side, that's why the EU, with each passing year, makes it more difficult to travel to for Russians to travel to Europe. In which turn, the Russians then reciprocate by making it more difficult to travel to Russia. They do this on purpose because they just don't want the people meeting each other and realizing that, hey, we're similar, or I like these guys and they like us and these are good people. That's the last thing they want.
Absolutely. This is you're getting
it goes back to, sorry, you said it many times, it goes back to the UK and the World Cup. I don't know if you want to mention that with the English going to Russia for the World Cup and saying, it's kind of nice here. It's not that bad.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, this is one of the events. This is back in 2018. There was a major campaign, as I remember, by the British government. This was, of course, directly the aftermath of the Skripal affair, to try to dissuade British fans, football fans, from going to Russia to attend the World Cup there. And some, of course, quite a few, but not as many as might otherwise have done, quite a few did nonetheless go. And you got all this extraordinary flood of messages, articles, even articles by sports journalists, who, by the way, are obviously less ideological than the political ones are, saying what an absolutely fantastic place it was and how it was the best organized World Cup and the amazing time they had there. And, you had all these stories circulating, and they did, to some extent, I think, have an effect across Britain, because a lot of people went to Russia. They saw a modern country, which is not what they'd expected or been led to expect, and a friendly people. And, one of the things that I was, noticed reading was a lot of people were saying that they were really surprised that they found that Russia was actually, an A grade, really advanced country. They'd imagined that they were going to some sort of backward place, and they were really astonished to find it isn't like that at all. So there was all these very favorable responses. And of course, the British government and the European leadership, they didn't like that at all. And they made absolutely sure that it was confined to the letters pages, to social media, and to a few sports writers. But overall, they just avoided talking about it as much as they could, and they clamped down as strongly as they could. By the way, and coming directly to Alex's point about them wanting to cut off communications and making it as difficult for Russians to travel to the West as possible and for Westerners to travel to Russia as possible. The latest brilliant idea from Ursula von der Leyen is to sanction Aeroflot. That's the Russian national airline, to try and prevent Aeroflot.
She is so, my God, she's so dumb.
I know. And, let's not assume it won't happen. I mean, this is always the problem. It's always in these people, always people like this, always seem to have the initiative.
Okay, game plan it out, Alexander. Game plan it out. The European Union sanctions Aeroflot. What does Russia do?
Well, it can do lots of things. First of all, it can sanction European airlines, but it can do much and something else.
You're talking Aeroflot, you're talking Pobeda, you're talking Russia, you're talking about the largest airline in Russia. I mean,
absolutely
massive airline.
Absolutely massive airline, one of the biggest in the world, by the way, and one of the best run too, by the way. But putting that aside, you do that. One thing the Russians could do, which would be extremely bad for the European exactly, they close their airspace to European airlines. So when they have to fly to Asia, because Russia is this enormous country, you add hours to the journey, and in order to get to Asia. So I mean, it's just stupid. It's absurd. It's utterly misguided. And as Aeroflot has pointed out, they don't actually have direct flights from Turkey and Iraq to Minsk. I mean, this isn't even true anyway. So I mean, it's something that Ursula von der Leyen has just come up with, which is no reality. Never did. But of course, she does these things. Of course, it's almost a reflex action. When something goes wrong, blame Russia. If the oil price goes up, blame Russia. If the oil price goes down, blame Russia. If there's too much gas, it's flowing around the European Union, well, that means we're dependent on Russia. So blame Russia. If there's not enough gas, blame Russia. If there's a migrant crisis on the border with Poland, blame Russia again and sanction their airline.
Yeah. I wonder when they're going to start blaming Russia for the UK migrant issue. But you know what would happen? Any European airline, any European citizen wanted to fly east, anywhere east, Eurasia, Asia, you name it, even the Middle East, many countries that want to even go to the Middle East, it would be just a nightmare. You would tack on 5 hours to each flight. Absolutely. It would be an absolute nightmare if Russia retaliated by closing its airspace. Should Ursula von der Leyen actually decide to sanction Aeroflot? Here's a quick question, and then we'll get back to the questions from the chat. It's almost like the globalists at the European Union are trying to engineer a way to make it difficult for people to travel in this great reset and in this green new world, isn't it?
Well, absolutely. Of course it is. Bear in mind, of course, globalization is always supposed to be about freedom, moving money and goods and people. But of course, in fact, in reality, it's freedom for some people, but not others. Going back to that earlier question, of course it is. They are in a kind of a way. Sometimes it always seems to me we worry too much about what the intentions of these people are. The effect of what they're doing is exactly that. They're making movement more difficult for people all the time as they advance their project. Let's actually look at the practical effects of this, because of course people would travel across Russia. They would fly across Russia to get to the Far East. Russia isn't going to close its airspace to everybody. They will fly on Asian airlines. They will fly on Singapore Air or Japan Air or on the Chinese airlines. And that means that the European airlines won't be able to compete with the Asian airlines, because, as Alex correctly says, they're not going to add another 5 hours to their journey for no conceivable reason. I've done those flights to Asia. I know how long they last. 13 hours, they're already long enough. 13 hours is just about bearable. 18 hours in economy class becomes impossible. So at that point, European airlines are going to find themselves struggling, as in effect, they're going to be frozen out of the Asian market. So Well done, Ursula.
Yeah.
Destroy another, vast industry across Europe, one that people's jobs depend on. Put yourself in a position where you say you're defending Europe, but you're really undermining it.
No problem. All the European citizens for their holidays or whenever they want to travel to Asia, they can just put on their Mark Zuckerberg, virtual reality metaverse glasses, and they can teleport to Singapore or to Hong Kong. No problem.
Absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Flying Boar says Ukraine is a glue that the EU cannot get off, and they are stuck with it financially.
Brilliant.
So the US is stuck with, as is the US. Yeah.
So true. Because of course you have idiots like that Ohio congressman telling us that this is some great strategic piece on the grand chessboard, when on the contrary, it's a black hole. It's something you throw money in with no end. If ever there was a bad investment decision, it was this one.
I'm laughing, Alexander, because you're going to lose money. It's a black hole. But if there's one person that did make a lot of money out of Ukraine, it was Hunter Biden. So,
well, of course it is. Well, of course, some people,
he's an artistic. He's an artistic. He's a Renaissance man.
He's a Renaissance man. You see, and he even is able to make money in the places where everyone else is losing it. So you see, he is a man of enormous abilities, quite clearly. But I mean, talking seriously, I mean, when you have such a disastrous loss-making proposition, loss-making from every conceivable point of view, you've wrecked your relations with Russia, you've got yourself bogged down in an intractable problem, you have a country that's going from bad to worse continuously. Well, what do? You liquidate your loss. That's what any businessman confronted with that kind of decision does. But of course they can't. They just are incapable of doing that sort of thing.
Yeah. Stan says, which U.S. state will get the nukes when the U.S. dissolves itself?
Oh, well, U.S.
Where are the nukes located in the U.S.? Do you know?
No, I don't know. That's the kind of granular detail I don't know. I'm going to say straightforwardly this. Every U.S. state has the intellectual resources to create these things. Some of them, if the US were to break up, would have the industrial and manufacturing resources to make them. I mean, Texas, for example, certainly could.
Yeah. Well, Texas and Florida, I think, would do very, very well.
Absolutely.
All around. Kurt says
that's not a call for the breakup of the US.
No,
I would be deeply upset if that ever happened. By the way, personally, I mean, I as somebody, as I said, who's spent most of my life, all my life, a great fan of the United States, I would be deeply upset if it happened. All I'm saying is, if it did happen, some of the states would be very, very viable economically and in those sort of terms that we've just been talking about.
Simon says that Alex, the US ICBM is mostly in red states.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
Let's see here. Kurt says at the moment, the US media is pushing the narrative that Russia is about to invade Ukraine. Yeah.
Yeah, of course they are. I mean, they do this all the time. I mean, just consider the inconsistencies of the reporting. So just a few days ago, we were getting reports from the US and Ukraine itself saying, well, actually, there's no worries, there's no real problems, there's no actual Russian troops on the border. And then a few days later, that whole story changes. The troops are exactly where they always were. They're in a place called Yelnya, which is far from the 150, whatever it is. It's closer to Moscow than it is to the border with Ukraine. And certainly it's very far, if you look at where Yelnya is, from the flashpoint areas in the Donbass. I happen to think that Yelnya is an important staging post. Positioning troops there means that in a crisis, you could move them forward quite rapidly. But it's not an aggressive move. It's not. There's no conceivable way that it's explicable in terms of some sort of attack on Ukraine. And of course, politically, it doesn't make any kind of sense to do anything like that at all. So why all this talk all of a sudden? Is it because they are worried that the Ukrainians might do something, or is it part of some bigger game that we haven't yet fathomed? Well, you could speculate about all sorts of things, but there is no Russian attack on Ukraine pending. There might be a Ukrainian attack on the Donbass republics, but given that the Russians have made it very clear, and have made it clear again, by the way, within the last few hours, that if such a thing happened, they would respond, then given that that is the case, I suspect that the phone lines are busy between Berlin and Paris and Kiev and Washington, I hope to some extent in Kiev, telling the Ukrainians don't start anything, because the very last thing we want is a situation in Ukraine where you're defeated and we're left humiliated.
Well, one faction of the White House is probably saying that. The other faction is probably pushing.
Well, exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think that if you're looking at the situation, thinking in somewhere like Berlin, for example, I'm pretty sure the Germans absolutely do not want a war in Ukraine at the moment.
Yeah. Adam says, could the EU ever push Poland towards Belarus and Russia?
Well, yes, and they're doing it already. But I mean, again, we come back to what Alex said that time ago. The Poles themselves they don't have the clarity here. They don't have the clarity that Orban has. Orban says, why should I have problems with Russia today when why can't I just put aside the fact of what happened in 1956 in Hungary, when the Russians suppressed the Hungarian Revolution, and before then, when they imposed this very hardline communist government on my country? Why can't I put all that aside? I put aside all the long history of difficult interactions between Hungary and Russia. I have good relations with Russia, and the result is, when I'm facing off against the EU, as I have to do all the time, I have more cards to play, and I find myself in a much stronger position. If the Poles did the same thing, they would find that they are in the same strong position that Orban is.
Yeah, Leafy Bug says, I think one of the problems with the EU is that no one has truly called their bluff yet. Even post-Brexit UK, when at the negotiating table, still does not seem to realize how much leverage it has over the EU.
You're completely right. And your point about Britain is well made, actually. The fundamental problem about Britain is that the establishment, the political class in Britain, still deeply regret Brexit. They still hanker for some kind of reconnection with the EU. So the result is that Britain doesn't play all its cards as strongly as it could do. If it finally psychologically made that break, then it would be in a position to play them. But at the moment, it plays its cards weakly, because, to change the metaphor, it's gone into a fight with one arm still tied behind its back.
Yeah. Carol says the U.S. will be back and better than ever. And Leafy Bug says the U.S. has a remarkable ability to reinvent itself. Alexander, those are excellent comments. Absolutely. Indeed.
I completely agree. And as I said, I've not given up on the US, as I've made very clear. And neither of us has, as we've made very clear in many programs. But that's, at the same time, we can't afford to be complacent. And things are being tested in the US like never before, in my opinion. I mean,
like the inflation.
Absolutely, well. Absolutely, inflation. I mean, well, every conceivable thing that you can imagine. I mean, not just the inflation. I mean, we don't want to go through all the range of policies, and we've got to be careful about where we're speaking. But I mean, all the various things that are going on up and down the US at the moment are just. I mean, some of them are completely wrong, and some of them are bizarrely wrong. That's all I can say about it.
Yeah. Well, I bring up inflation because Simon asked the question, or he makes the comment, how will the EU deal with the 15% plus inflation, sky-high energy prices, and the migration crisis all coming in 2022? My point is that the U.S. is going through an inflation crisis, which will not go away and will get worse because a lot more money is being printed. And of course, it's not going to cost the Americans anything. And they already have the money for this, Alexander, by the way. Joe Biden says the money's already there. But the EU is also going to go through terrible inflation. And I'm seeing it actually here every day as well. Prices are going up.
Absolutely, of course they are, and they're much higher. And by the way, I think Simon's point is a good one, because the United States has infinitely greater resiliency, in my opinion, in the face of this crisis than the EU does. The EU is a far more brittle institution. I say that. I'm not, things are not good. We have in the US a president who isn't a president, an administration that is completely dysfunctional. Nothing is working well, but at least it remains a country. Whereas in the EU, it's just this bizarre thing, which it's still very difficult to define. And Simon is absolutely right. All of these problems are going to get much worse next year. I think in parts of the EU, we are already in double-digit inflation. I've heard reports that they already are in Italy, for example, that the true rate of inflation in Italy is close to 16%, not whatever it is that they say it is. So it's much higher than people are saying, probably higher in Greece too, much higher than the official reports imply. So we're going to have major problems on that front. And the migrant crisis, this business with the Polish border, is a distraction from the real crisis which is coming. And that crisis is going to center a lot on Afghanistan. And I was reading reports now that the country, Afghanistan, is now close to famine conditions, because all aid the whole economic system existed under the previous regime through handouts. Those handouts have stopped. The result is that everything there, apparently, economically speaking, is breaking down. Now, I don't know whether this is the case. I haven't been able to, I'm not on the ground, but that's what some people are reporting, that Afghanistan is close to economic collapse. Now, if it is, think what that's going to mean. I mean, they're going to be moving west. They're not going to be staying in Turkey. They're not going to be staying in Russia. They're going to want to come to the EU again.
To Germany,
to Germany. I mean, that's exactly what they going to do. So, I mean, and I've forgotten what the current population of Afghanistan is, but it's, there's a lot of people there, young people there, and they're going to be moving westwards to Europe. What's the game plan when they come? Who's making any preparations? Who's thinking about this? Who's looking further along and working out, how we should prepare for this kind of thing? No one. Ursula, Charles Michel, Josep Borrell, Angela Merkel, of course she's going, Olaf Scholz. None of these people is doing anything. Christine Lagarde. who is preparing us?
Who's going to save Italy? Draghi?
Draghi? As I said, who's preparing for this tidal wave that may be coming?
Elaine says the EU should never have been allowed to develop into a political union with so much power over the member states. Absolutely agree with that. And Alexander W. Baker says, this is an interesting comment. Will the Germans stand for this sort of inflation?
Well, that is an excellent question. Now, I haven't been able to go to Germany for a while, but of course I used to travel there regularly. I mean, I have very strong connections with Germany. Last time I was there, people were already grumbling a lot about the economic situation, about zero interest rates and things of this kind. And they were feeling very undermined by this. This is, of course, before the pandemic. Then the pandemic came, things changed. Politics changed, the AfD fell apart, or didn't fall apart exactly, but anyway, it became over-factionalized, and things seem to go back to normal. But ultimately, I think those sources of disaffection are still there in Germany, and I think they're going to grow. And I think there's Germany, people have got this thing about Germany and inflation, wrong actually in some respects. In this, it's probably true that there are these lingering memories of Weimar, and people worry about that. And a point people also tend to overlook is that Germany also had another major hyperinflation episode at the end of the Second World War, and in its immediate aftermath. The currency, the old German currency, the Reichsmark, collapsed basically and had to be replaced by an entirely new currency, the Deutschmark. So there are these historic memories of inflation. But the more important point is that the German economic system relies upon low inflation. It's the way in which money circulates within the system and the way in which these businesses and companies that make up the Mittelstand, the industrial core, if you like, of Germany, how they're able to work. Because some of them actually, I mean, people don't realize this, they're not particularly profitable. They work very much on sort of margins. So they've got to keep a fairly liquid financial system running to keep them going. And that can only happen on the basis of low inflation. So if inflation starts to rise, it's going to hurt the German economic system incredibly badly. It could destabilize it severely. So what the Germans will do in that kind of situation, I simply don't know. Whether the political class in Germany has the imagination to respond to this, I don't know. The big parties, the SPD, the CDU, CSU, the Greens, those sort of parties, probably their response will be the usual imbecilic one that Macron comes up with: more Europe, the solution to every problem. but I suspect that other people in Germany will start to say, well, look, this isn't working. Everything is falling apart. Our economy has lost dynamism anyway for over many years, and there are reasons connected to the EU which are the cause for that. So we're just importing inflation, and we have to find a way out. And how that will play out, I just don't know.
Yeah. Kelly says, wants to know, have you discussed the role of the Ukrainian diaspora in the U.S. and Ukrainian politics and foreign policy? I posted earlier that Biden's significant contacts go back 40 years. I don't know about Biden's connections to the Ukrainian diaspora. I wouldn't be surprised if there's connections there, given that Biden was actually charged with overseeing Ukraine after the Obama coup. But I know of Canada and Freeland's
absolutely. I mean, this
connection
is,
to.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, this is one of the great changes that has happened in international relations is the way that Canada's foreign policies have changed. A process massively hastened, of course, by Trudeau, but which was already there before, and where Canada always played a stabilizing role in the international system. Now it's become a very much
a destabilizing role.
A destabilizing role, absolutely. And part of that, undoubtedly, is the fact that the Ukrainian diaspora there, which is very big and very well organized and very politicized, has an influence, an outsized influence on the Canadian government. I'm sure this is also true to extent in the US. And, you know, it's something we've touched on in previous programs, but we've never actually discussed it in great detail. I'm going to make my own view here clear, which is that though the diaspora, the Ukrainian diaspora, has undoubtedly played a role in all of this, ultimately the problem with the US and its US policy is not any diaspora. It is the neocon attitudes that have gained such a tremendous hold in the US and in the US government and in the US media. And those, of course, are also intimately connected with the deep state and with the military-industrial complex, which is always pushing for the US to interfere in every conceivable place and all the time. I did a program recently about Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, who outed himself. Actually, he exposed his mindset very clearly in an interview he gave with Fareed Zakaria, and showed himself to be an absolute unreconstructed neoliberal globalist. Well, he didn't become that because the Ukrainian diaspora made him that way. He made that because the places he was educated at and the kind of mindset he has been cultivated into a neoliberal globalist one, because that's the kind of education, that's the kind of social position that he comes from. And of course, the fact that he's close to the Clintons, well, it explains it all.
He was involved in Russiagate too.
He was involved in Russiagate, of course he was, as has now become clear.
Yeah, and he got his position in the government for being involved in Russiagate. You see how that works? Yeah.
Absolutely.
W. Baker says the Afghan situation was designed to leave a failed state on the Russia-Chinese borders. And Turius says that, connected to what you were saying about Afghanistan, Alexander, and the impending migrant crisis that is coming, says that Orban is preparing as much as he can. He is trying to reach a compromise with Erdogan specifically for that reason.
Well, he did. A very good point, because let's start with Erdogan, because I was saying that Ursula, Josep Borrell, Charles Michel, Olaf Scholz, Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron, Christine Lagarde, Emilio Draghi, they're absolutely doing nothing. They're just waiting. They're not even thinking about this. Orban goes to Turkey, talks with Erdogan, and is preparing Hungary's defenses. So you see the contrast between a leader who thinks ahead and other leaders who are just absorbed with their own utopian fantasies and their particular obsessions. So, note that difference. I agree. I think there was a decision made that, that if they had to quit Afghanistan, they were going to create a crisis in the place, and they calculated that this crisis would be cause real problems for the Russians and the Chinese. It might do. I'm not saying that it won't, and that might happen, but I think the Russians and the Chinese, who are totally unsentimental and practical about these matters, will know what to do. It's the European Union that's going to be paying the price, just as in 2015 it was the European Union that paid the price, with a lot of help from Angela Merkel, for the crash that was US policy in the Middle East following the Arab Spring. So ultimately, the people you're going to destabilize are not the Russians and the Chinese. It will be your own allies in Europe. But of course, it's very easy when you get into that situation. You can always blame Putin. He will have weaponized the crisis. He will have engineered the crisis in Afghanistan. And if there is a mass tidal wave of people coming from there, well, it'll be Mr. Putin who's to blame.
Yeah. Flying Boar says, have you seen the report that there is 016, January 6th protester seeking asylum in Belarus? What do you think of that? I actually did a video on that.
Absolutely. I have seen it. I haven't watched Alex's video, but I suspect he's covered the thing.
It's an interesting story. It's an interesting story, and it just shows what kind of I guess I don't want to say upside down world, but yeah, it's kind of everything's kind of flip-flopped, hasn't it? Because you would never hear something like that maybe 10 years ago, would you? 15 years ago, but
inconceivable. Inconceivable.
And Lukashenko is milking it, obviously. He's getting his PR and his propaganda in. But more to the point, Alexander, it shows that the direction that the U.S. legal system is going in, with the fact that it's, for lack of a better word, it's like they're hunting down their own citizens in a way. It's not a good look.
We need to cover this fully, because there's so much to say here. So much to say about the whole issue. The only thing is, I'm going to suggest that this is a good topic for locals. And I suggest we do programs about it there, because the whole business of this affair, and the legal system, and the way the FBI is operating, and the Project Veritas business, and the fact that stories of privileged correspondence between a journalist and his lawyers is being published in the New York Times. All of this is so disturbing and so concerning at so many levels that it leads a proper, full, in-depth and straightforward and open and honest discussion. So if I could just say to people, let's discuss this fully on Locals, let's do programs about it, and maybe that's a good topic for another live stream. As I said, I do them on Wednesday.
Yeah, I agree. That is a good topic to jump into. as well as the Rittenhouse topic, and there's a lot of topics to dig into there.
Absolutely. I mean, can I just say about that particular trial? I already made some comments about that in the Black Pigeon CRP
stream
program that we streamed, that we've talked about. But again, it requires much discussion. And in fact, if you go back on on our history, you'll find that we discussed that particular case shortly after the incident which has given rise to it. And everything that's now turning out at the trial vindicates our original reporting.
Yeah. Mechanizia Shan says, Alexander, been studying stamps this week. Found it rather amusing that the fascist countries of the day were posting poison mushrooms stamps.
Oh, I had no idea. This is something entirely new. I've never been interested in that sort of thing. My father-in-law, who passed away just over a month ago, he was a massive stamp collector, and it's quite interesting to see his stamps. And so, I mean, I can understand the interest, but I've never myself been involved in it. And that's really fascinating, actually. You can learn an awful lot about
it. It's a fascinating hobby.
It's a fascinating hobby, yeah.
Absolutely. Can be quite lucrative, too.
Absolutely, yeah.
Rich says, even if Russia wasn't abused by the West in this way, even then they wouldn't have wanted to align with the U.S. to counter China. Their neighbor Russia has a mind of its own.
Completely true. This is an important thing to say. I mean, the question for the Russians, at least after the Boris Yeltsin neoliberal era ended, was never, do we ally with the West against China? The question was, are we going to ally with China against the West? And very much the desire was no. They initially wanted to be on good terms with both groups, maintaining a kind of equidistance and trading freely with both, and acting as an independent, sovereign force, and arguably a stabilizing one. That was certainly what Putin's desires were when he began to realize that Russia could not integrate into Western institutions on equal terms. And that was very much the idea. It's only in the last 5 or 6 years that the Russians have come to the conclusion that this is even that isn't possible, and that they have to forge this alliance with China, which, to be very clear, it was the Chinese always who were seeking. Go to the Chinese media and they talk about the Russian-Chinese strategic partnership all the time. They dwell and harp on it, and they congratulate themselves on the fact that they've achieved it. The Russians had far more doubts about it. They weren't, for a long time, they resisted it, but they would never have allied themselves with the West against China as part of an independent policy. They sought stable relationships with both power blocks. They never imagined that they would be forced, as they have done now, to align themselves with one.
Yeah. Flying Boar wants an update on Nord Stream 2 and an update on the EU gas crisis.
Well, the EU gas crisis is getting worse. It's actually getting worse. This is, Ursula published the Commission, the European Commission, published a report which said that we don't need to worry because gas prices are going to start falling naturally in late 2022. Why do you think they will start falling then? But,
naturally,
absolutely, whatever that means.
An act of nature.
An act of nature, exactly. So I mean, it's getting worse. And before then, the trend is for them to continue to rise. Why shouldn't they rise? All the other prices are rising. It's natural that natural gas prices on the European spot market, which is where the Europeans now foolishly buy much of their gas instead of agreeing these long-term contracts, are going to rise because we're in a global inflation situation. So why should gas be different? So, of course, it's going to go on rising. And, of course, that will in turn contribute to higher inflation. And, by the way, coming back to Germany, the fact that gas prices are rising in Germany, combined with the microchip shortage, means that the German car industry is now under extreme stress. I happen to know this. And German industrial production is either flat or actually falling, because it's now got this double whammy of the gas price rises and the microchip shortage combining together to cause all the hitting the Germans in the most vulnerable way. But anyway, so gas is getting worse. Gas is getting bad. Now, the German government has now said that it's told the regulator that Nord Stream 2 poses no threat to European energy security. And Markus Söder, who is the minister-president of Bavaria, one of the most powerful German states, has now come out openly and said he was one of the people who at one time seemed likely he might become chancellor, but the CDU passed him by. And anyway, he's come out openly and he said, we've got to get Nord Stream 2 up and running as soon as possible. The latest word is that it's going to be certified and up and running by January. So they're already wasting much of the winter, agonizing and prevaricating over this thing. And that's causing already mounting problems in Germany and across Europe. It's highly likely we're going to see gas shortages across Europe. It's certainty we're going to see gas prices happening over Europe. And of course, if there's a war in Ukraine, which is one reason why I think the Germans don't want to see a war in Ukraine. If there's a war in Ukraine, well, I mean, that will, of course, finally reopen the question of Nord Stream 2, and then gas prices will just go.
What war? I mean, look, Rand says new cars have 3,000 microchips, more or less. Yeah, I mean, they're full of, absolutely, it's a disaster. All of this is, everything is unraveling.
Yeah.
What war in Ukraine could there possibly be? It won't be a war. It'll just be Russia, literally, which they don't want to do.
No.
I firmly believe Russia doesn't want to engage in any conflict with Ukraine whatsoever. That's the last thing they want. But should that happen, I mean, it would just be Russia just kind of rolling over the East and deciding where they want to stop. Literally, they're going to decide where they want to stop.
Exactly. And any idea that American warships in the Black Sea are going to interfere is just nonsense. It's rubbish.
And no country, the EU as well, Alexander.
Absolutely. But I entirely agree. It is not what they want. Why would they want it? It's only going to land them with lots more problems that they're not interested in at the moment. So the Russians don't want it. The only way there could be a war would be if Ukraine started one. And instead of people doing what they ought to be doing, which is phoning up Kiev, sending people to Kiev, talking to Zelensky, talking to his military officials, and it's debatable how far he even controls his military officials, giving them very clear warnings that a war is just a disastrous idea. What they do instead is the opposite. They blame Russia, which is a force of restraint in the situation, and of course they do it in a way that can only encourage Ukraine. By the way, I was very interested to see that the latest victim of the media purge in Ukraine is the Kiev Post, which is the English language website newspaper there. And given that it has taken a rigidly pro-Maidan, anti-Russia position, the fact that it's apparently been, all the journalists there have been sacked, it tells you something about how fraught the situation in Ukraine is, and the fact that, as I said, you can't be hardline enough, apparently, for the present authorities. I mean, it's just...
You don't need a war in Ukraine for the country to unravel. It's already unraveling. The country, this whole Maidan project, which once again was started by the Obama government and by the European Union, this Maidan project is unraveling. And one final note, and it was Angela Merkel that put a stake in the heart of Ukraine when she said, you know what, Nord Stream 2.
Absolutely, completely agree with all of that. I mean, and just to reiterate again a point about Nord Stream 2, it's not just that Ukraine loses the transit fees, serious though that is. It is that without gas flowing down those pipelines to Europe, Ukraine loses its access to Russian gas, which is what it uses for heating and to power what's left of its industries. It pretends it's not siphoning off that gas. It pretends that it's importing that gas from Europe, and it's paying the Europeans the price for that gas as part of this pretense that there's something called reverse flow. But if that gas is not flowing down those pipelines, it can't do that, because you can't send gas up a pipeline.
They're such liars.
Designed to send it down. Exactly. It's just exactly. Well, if you indulge in fairy tales, then of course when you crash down to earth, it hurts. And I mean, lies is exactly what it is. Reverse flow is a lie. I'm not just the person who says that. It's not just the Putin who's saying that. Yulia Tymoshenko, who is the Ukrainian politician, pro-Maidan, the so-called gas princess, she's come out and she said it too. Reverse flow is a fiction. It's a lie. It's a lie sold to the Ukrainian people by their leaders, and it's a lie sold to the West as well. It enables Ukraine to pretend that it's not using Russian gas when it is in fact entirely dependent on Russian gas, except for that gas which it produces itself and a certain amount of gas it imports from Turkmenistan. Overwhelmingly, it is using Russian gas, except that it's paying the Europeans for it instead of the Russians, paying higher prices to the Europeans for it. The Europeans, in turn, pay the price difference to the Russians. I mean, it's just a ludicrous, constructed, fantastic, deceitful, dishonest thing, which, when Ukraine loses its position as a transit state, it stops.
They just make shit up. I mean, reverse gas flow. They just make it up, and then they sit there and they ask the question, why doesn't the population believe us when it comes to certain other things? And people here understand what I'm talking about. Why don't they believe us? Well, we don't believe you guys because you literally make crap up like reverse gas flow. It is the stupidest thing in the world, but whatever they have to do in order to make it look like they're not getting gas from Russia. It's beyond stupid. And these are the people that are going to lead us out of all these crises that we have going on right now. This is not a bug, Alexander. This is a feature that we have these stupid people in power. This is a feature, and they're driving the entire world into the freaking ground.
Absolutely. It's a systemic thing right across the board.
Zariel says that in Germany, prices are skyrocketing and the people haven't started to budget. Was shopping yesterday 10 to 15% inflation.
Well, there you go. I mean, as I said, I haven't been there. I should contact my German friends and acquaintances, including business people, and find out what they're saying. But I mean, I'm pretty sure that they're noticing the difference. And one of the things I'll be very interested to see, by the way, is whether it makes people revise their support for the Greens, because of course Germany has been the great driver of green politics. Green politics really started in Germany in an organized form, though they were very different when they started in the 70s and 80s than they are today. But I'll be very curious to see whether people today in Germany start to rethink some of these green policies that they've been following so religiously for so long.
Yeah. Let's see. Sidebook VR says, frustrated hearing some say the U.S. can easily up interest rates to down inflation. They can print more to cover interest rates and makes perfect sense because of the dollar.
Well, that is, I think, the view that many people in authority have, that the US can do anything. It can increase interest rates, lower interest rates, run budget deficits at 5% of GDP, 15% of GDP, 20% of GDP, 50% of GDP, spend its way out of any problem by printing money, because as the United States has the world's reserve currency, it can afford to do that, because so long as people use the dollar, the United States really can't have a situation where hyperinflation can possibly take off. I think that's an incredibly complacent and extremely dangerous view. I think if interest rates in the US were to rise, then simultaneously increasing the money supply, all that's going to do, it's not going to reduce inflation, it's going to increase it. And it's going to undermine even further the underlying problems of the United States, because because by creating debt bubbles and all sorts of things. Because if you're simultaneously increasing the money supply as you're raising interest rates, if you're trying to sort of offset the one with the other, then you're doing away with, you're ending, you're abolishing, in effect, the positive effect of increasing the interest rates. You're just in effect negating the interest rate increase. I mean, it's just stupid. At that point, if you really want to get on your grip, you on top of your inflation crisis, what you'd really have to do is increase interest rates even more, and then you'd be presumably in a race to increase your budget. I mean, it's just your budget deficit.
Yeah.
I mean, it's nonsense. It's the sort of thing. I know there are people, AOC and her like, who probably think in that kind of way.
Well, she's one of the greatest economists of our time.
Absolutely, you can't. Of course, I mean, she's got vast experience and understanding of these things. I mean, she's understood the secrets of economics, which are baffling and mysterious to all other people.
Yeah, but she's being listened to. That's the maddening part.
And she's not just being listened to. Of course, she has a devoted following. No question about this. And of course, she's also got a big media following too.
Yeah.
And there are economists out there who should know better, and who I think deep down do know better, who go along with all this.
Yeah, there are economists that know better, that should say, just stop. They should tell people like AOC, stop.
Yes.
Because you don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Yes.
Just stop.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Zariel says, Charhard sent a super chat and is asking, will China bail out Evergrande's Western offshore investors?
That is a very, very big question. Now, I don't know the answer to that. First of all, I mean, to be very clear, Evergrande is a problem, but the underlying problem is China's property bubble, which has been allowed to get, it hasn't been allowed to get to big dimensions. The Chinese government, it's become quite clear now that what it was doing for several years, for about the last 10 years or so, is that in order to maintain the fiction of double-digit growth, it was blowing a property bubble. And Xi Jinping, to give some credit to where he's due, he appears to have understood that this is unsustainable and has finally decided that something has to be done, and he's acted to stamp it down. Now, he might have been forced to do that because he's aware that things are going wrong further down the road, but he's got this problem of his property bubble to deal with. I think China, I've said this many times, I think China has the savings, because the Chinese are massive savers. I think it's got the savings to actually deal with this property bubble. I think it can get through this problem, even though, to be absolutely clear about this, growth on the other side of it will be lower than it was before. But that is necessary as an economy develops. You can't maintain double-digit growth indefinitely. That is a foolish mistake. You destabilize your economy by doing it. Now, the question is, as you unravel that property bubble, what do you do with companies like Evergrande, which bear all the hallmarks of a company that has floated on this bubble and has, as a result, become, frankly, less than a company, a real business, and more of a speculative enterprise? I mean, it's been doing all sorts of weird and wonderful things, and it's an indicator of an out of control bubble, that it was both able and allowed to do those things. What does the Chinese government do? Now, I think it's got to I think it's got to unwind Evergrande, and I think in order to preserve China's position globally, I think it probably will bail out the outside bondholders. I mean, maybe it shouldn't. Maybe it's the wrong thing to do. Maybe it reinforces moral hazard. Many would say, perhaps fairly and justly, that people who invest in a company like Evergrande and lose their money are deserve it because they should have done their due diligence properly. I accept all of that, but I think as a practical matter, I think the Chinese government will probably say to itself, situation internationally is bad enough already. We've got the money to bail out Evergrande, at least the bondholders, the foreign bondholders. Let's just do it. Let's liquidate this thing. Let's unravel this bubble internally in an orderly way. Let's try to protect people's savings, ordinary Chinese people's savings. We've got the money to do it. We can do it. But let's make sure that this kind of bubble never happens again. So I think the probability is that they will pay the bondholders. But I'm not absolutely sure. And just on the topic of Evergrande, I understand that bankruptcy proceedings have now been initiated against it in Germany. So, the window to do that is small.
It's small, yeah. A. Sanchez says, I'm of the belief that American and British political class are hostage to the view of Russians as the boogeyman. They view them as an easy tool to scare people, sacrificing good relations for short-term political gains. Well said.
I think that is very well said. And of course, it's not just misguided and short-sighted, it's actually disastrous. I mean, we go back to that point about a two-front war, which is what we're ending up with. I mean, take on China in the Pacific and take on Russia in Europe, both at the same time. I mean, what a reckless thing to do. What a foolish position to find oneself in.
Yeah. Louis Tang, thank you for that super sticker. Really appreciate it. And Irish Partisan, member of the Duran community, with the comment, go Brandon. Yep. That is the meme of the century.
Absolutely.
Of the century. What a cell phone too.
Absolutely. One of the really amusing things, one finds moments of real fun and laughter, and is to read all these stuffy, stiff American liberals writing about how outrageous this is, and what a sign that people come up with go Brandon, that this shows the general right, the advance of the ultra rightist troopers, whatever it is. It's just crazy to see the way some people have lost their sense of humor in the United States. On the liberal left side is actually very funny. If I have to say it, I mean, it really is.
It's funny to watch them lose their sense of humor.
I mean, the pomposity, the touchiness. It's just comical, actually.
It's such a cell phone too. They brought it onto themselves. In trying to protect him, they damaged him more.
Absolutely, of course they did. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. Thank you very much, Irish Partisan, for that. Rich says, when it comes to skills vanishing in nuclear technology, Italy has not lost the manufacturing of such technology. Unlike the rest of Western Europe, 100% manufacturing.
Absolutely. Well, can I just say, I mean, Italy has the biggest industrial base in Europe after Germany. It has tremendous flair and abilities. Think of all these Italian products that one knows about. Think of Ferrari cars. Just one example, Maserati, all these. I mean,
fashion industry,
fashion industry, all these products that Italy produces. It's big machine tool manufacturer, fitness machines, ships, Smeg fridges, and all that kind of thing. I mean, Italy is an industrial and design powerhouse with tremendous technological and technical skills. It punches far below its weight, because its political class is so dysfunctional, and they've allowed also the financial system to get out of control. But the problems with debt that people hear are very much concentrated on the Italian government and local governments. Actually, private business in Italy historically has been run very well.
Yeah. Well, I'll say this, you look at countries like Greece, and their manufacturing got completely decimated. So
absolutely.
The fact that Italy is still able to hold on to that is a positive sign.
It's a positive sign, but it's weaker than it was. I mean, Italian industrial power, Italy's economy grew steadily and strongly all the way up to the point when they first joined the European exchange rate mechanism, the precursor to the euro. And of course, after they joined the euro, since then, Italy has stagnated and its position has weakened. And it's very strange that there's still so much resistance within Italy itself to understanding that that is connected to Italy's position inside the euro system. The euro is like the cancer that is undermining all the economies, including, by the way, Germany's. Germany only seems a beneficiary. In reality, it is not.
Yeah. Hey, Alan Watson is in the chat and locals. Welcome, Alan Watson. How are you doing? Let's see. Leafy Bug says Northern Italy possesses the most advanced manufacturing sector in Europe.
Well, I mean, they make amazing ships, even aircraft. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Jan Schoenfields, thank you very much for that $10 super chat. We really appreciate it. And we go to Rocky Lux, who says many neocons are from the Walsh School of Foreign Service, Georgetown University, which is Jesuit. Were there historical events which motivates their prejudice towards the Orthodox Church, i.e. Russia?
Well, that may be true. I mean, all I know is that Georgetown University plays an outsized role in creating the foreign policy elite of the United States. It's not just, I mean, Georgetown, John Hopkins, that cluster of universities in Washington, D.C.
I know that university well. Yeah, I know that area well. Lived very close to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
well.
Yes. Now, whether Georgetown University's Catholic roots play any role in all of this, I mean, that's the first time I've heard that. It wouldn't surprise me, but I'm not going to say that it's so because I just don't know, to be honest.
Yeah. It's an excellent question, though. It's very interesting. Megawit, thank you very much for your super sticker. Appreciate it. And Mark Hewitt said Pelosi threatened the secession of California if Trump won in 2020. If you were the U.S. president, would you let California, given a lot of political poison comes from that state? That's I've heard some analysts, Alexander, say that the U.S. would be better off without California. Some serious analysts as well.
I know that.
Just throw that out. You wouldn't want it to happen. But I have heard analysts say that the U.S. would be more united.
I know. I have heard that. I mean, again, I'm not somebody who would be. I mean, I would find it very difficult. I've never been to California, I should say. I've never visited these places. But in my own sort of mental image of the United States, a situation where Los Angeles and San Francisco were no longer US cities would be very difficult to imagine. I mean, given how iconic in a way, what a huge role those cities have played in forming my idea of what the US is. So I personally, at an emotional level, would find it a huge wrench. I don't know whether it's going to happen. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't know whether it would leave the rest of the United States more coherent. I'm worried actually that it's more likely to have what would be the more likely effect is that if one state broke away, that might encourage others to do the same. So, I don't know, Massachusetts, maybe if liberal states to break away or whatever. What I think is possibly more likely to happen, and I've also heard that this is happening, is that parts of California might split away and form another state the sense
go into other states
or go into
that you're seeing happening. Yeah, yes. That you're seeing happening.
Yes. Yes. So that, it seems to me, is probably more likely to happen if California were to either be broken off or break away. As I said, personally, I would be sad. I mean, that's all I think I can say about that. And I'm not sure that it would be a good thing. In fact, I'd rather doubt it.
Well, there was a time when Reagan was the governor. So
absolutely,
things can change.
Things can change. Absolutely, of course they can. Yeah.
Yeah.
But that was a very different California, it must be said. I mean, the days when California was could often vote for Republicans. I mean, that was a different place in those days than the California that you see now. I mean, San Francisco and Los Angeles especially have changed radically.
Yeah. Divine Insurgent says Americans say Los Angeles, Britons say Los Angeles.
Well, Britain, Los Angeles. Well, I've never come across. I always say Los Angeles myself, but anyway, whatever.
Thank you very much for that super chat. Yeah,
British people. A lot of British people say LA. By the way.
LA, yeah. Oh, yeah.
No.
Let's see. Flying Boar says Orban has better cards to play against the EU than Poland because Orban's relationship with Russia and China are strong.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, yeah. And the Poles, if they were wise, would learn from that.
Good point. Absolutely. Char Hard sent the $4.99 super chat. Thank you very much for that. Stick Botson says, Alex, my friend, I hereby buy you an Ouzo. Cheers. Thank you very much for that super chat. Ouzo sounds good right about now, even though it's more of a summer drink for me. Yeah. Let's see here. Flying Boar says, have you seen the report that there are... Oh, no, I've done that one with the asylum seeker in Belarus. That one I've done. Kurt says, what's the sentiment towards Russia in Ukraine among the general population? Getting more positive or hostile in today's world?
This is so interesting because, of course, you get all these opinion polls which appear to suggest enormous hostility, which I don't, by the way, buy. If you actually look at the polling results, they've barely shifted. I mean, people in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine still support politicians who say they want better relations with Russia. Politicians who know about, by the way, being rounded up and arrested. You still have people in western Ukraine who remain deeply hostile to Russia. And you have the people in central Ukraine who sometimes shift towards the one and sometimes shift towards the other. Tymoshenko's power base historically has been central Ukraine. And the fact that she's now coming out and saying that she wants that Ukraine should seek some kind of rapprochement with Russia and do a gas deal with gas, exactly, to my mind, probably suggests that sentiment in central Ukraine is moving in that direction, and that's the swing region. But that I would put that as a much better indicator of how people really feel and what they really think than some of the opinion polls you see churned out, which are churned out, by the way, by polling agencies that I don't trust.
Yeah. Simon says here, migrant crisis 2.0, 10 to 15 million plus.
Well, it would. I mean, I'm not going to discuss figures because I'm not in a position. I just don't have that knowledge. But believe me, if we see people moving from Afghanistan, it's going to be on a far bigger scale. I mean, it's going to make this business on the Polish border look like a drop compared to a tidal wave.
Yeah, the EU can't handle it either.
No, they won't know how to handle it. They will crumble, and of course, I mean, the ideological tensions that would erupt then would be off the scale, I suspect. I mean, you'd have some people who say, we must welcome them all in because that's what we are all about now, and that's our identity. Those are our values. And of course, you'd have others who say impossible. The politics in the EU will change radically in that kind of situation, particularly if there's an economic crisis underway, which I, like Simon, I think is far more likely than not.
Yeah. Rich says, it is said that the U.S. has the ability to revitalize. Then China is doing it for 3,000 years, Russia for 1,000 years, Italy for 3,000 years, and many Asian nations.
Well, nations have enormous ability to revive and revitalize. I mean, I don't even call it a federation or a confection. This thing that the European Union is, I can't see how it can. What it is doing is preventing countries like Germany, Italy, France, Spain from revitalizing themselves because it insists upon enforcing upon them a uniform set of policies that are ideologically constructed. So the United States, they can change, they can move, they can shift around, they can come up with new ideas, they can come up with new types of politicians, they can change their politics, they can rearrange their economy, they can tap into the enormous entrepreneurial skills and energy of their people, because they can do that, because they're a nation. European Union can't, but it is preventing the nations of Europe from doing it.
Yeah. Let's see what else we have here. One sec, Alexander. Let me pull it up. Sovereign Rebel says skyrocketing fertilizer prices linked to natural gas likely to greatly reduce use and thus reduce food production. Yes. Comment, please. Well, don't worry. Bill Gates is preparing for all of us to eat bugs. So
that's right. He's well, I said, the entrepreneurial flair of the American people. Bill Gates gives that an extra dimension, which you must never underestimate. I mean, he comes up with all these wonderful new ideas. But talking seriously, this is going to be another huge problem, because obviously this is going to cause enormous hardship in the developed world, in Europe, in North America, and whatever. But of course, in the global South, for people who live on the margins, this is going to be an enormous crisis. I mean, and what will people do? So it's a good question, and it's an excellent question. It's a very top question. It's a powerful point, and it's absolutely spot on. It's spot on, right?
It just shows how much is connected to oil and gas.
Yeah, everything is connected. Everything connects with each other. It's a fact which people don't understand. So if you're going to come up with some political project, you've got to work out the economics of it. You've got to sit down and think it through and work out how it actually, what actual effects it's going to have. I remember when back they launched the euro. I remember not just, myself, but lots of other people were saying that the Europeans weren't doing that they weren't actually sitting down and thinking through what it would actually mean to have a single currency, and what the economic effect on the individual economies would be. Of course, it's possible that some people did do that and they kept it to themselves because they wanted some of the results. Who's to know? Mm-hmm.
Rich says Italy, Germany are head-to-head in industrial strength.
Well, I'm not going to say one way or the other. I mean, I don't know. But I mean, Germany is, of course, the big export machine. Italy has a tremendous industrial base. Italy's certainly a major industrial power. It's a shame that it's never translated that into political influence, because, Italy has produced extraordinary, insightful statespeople, and it could do again. I mean, it could be a stabilizing country in international affairs.
Flying Boar says, what are the Russians' view on BLM? Because the new Russian liberals recently criticized the group and they want nothing to do with them.
Well, can I just say, if you want to know what the Russians think, you should read Putin's Valdai speech, in which he discussed that at great length. I have to be incredibly careful what I say, because obviously we're on a particular platform. But basically, the Russians are entirely critical. And Putin, in his comments, quoted Martin Luther King and made the point that Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement of the 1960s had wanted everybody to feel that things like color no longer mattered, which is the opposite of what we're seeing today.
Fantastic speech. Let's see. Mark Case says, you should do a show on the energy crisis and the snobbing of politically friendly Canadian oil from Alberta.
We should do.
Biden is thinking of closing another pipeline.
I know.
I believe it from Ontario down to Michigan, if I'm not mistaken.
Absolutely. Which
line 5 is the pipeline, yeah.
Exactly, which is so typical again of ideologues and ideological thinking, which is that you don't adjust your policies to the facts. You just double down your double down your policies in defiance of the facts. That's what ideologues do. Because, of course, if they started to adjust their politics, then they would admit that the facts are different from what they said. And they can't do that because that would call the entire ideology into question.
Yep. Hello, Cosmic. Welcome to the Locals Chat. Good to see you there. Where are we, Alexander? Moving along here. Anaf Habib says, thoughts on the plenary session. Xiism, as shaped by the gray eminence of Wang Huning, is now the fourth ideology recognized by the party. After Confucianism, Maoism, and Dengism, China has broken officially with globalism proper.
You know, I'm not up to date with this. I know that there's been an important plenum in China. To be straightforward about this, I'm not very up to speed with Chinese internal politics and that sort of thing. Though I ought to say that one of my best and oldest friends is an academic who writes on precisely this subject. So maybe I should speak with him about this. But I do actually get the impression that the Chinese, well, first of all, the Chinese, when they talk about globalism, they mean something completely different from everybody else. That's an important point to make, actually. What the Chinese mean about globalism is a situation where they can export as much as they want to everybody, and where everybody opens up their doesn't have tariffs and barriers to Chinese goods. So, in fact, it's a very mercantilistic conception of globalism. Now that I think the Chinese are beginning to understand that post-Trump, as a result of Trump, that kind of globalism no longer exists and is no longer viable. And now that they're starting to see the full implications of what this whole doctrine, this whole philosophy actually means, I think they're beginning to adjust and change their views and becoming increasingly and outspokenly critical of it. So certainly a central committee plenum of that nature in China is important, but I'm not going to discuss it in more detail than that because as I said, I haven't really followed it closely.
Yeah. Michael Redmond, $5 super chat. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. And Peter says the FBI doesn't tread on Russian ground, but what about on NATO member state like Montenegro? As Alex noted yesterday, an American fled to Belarus. What about Montenegro and NATO?
Oh, absolutely. No, I mean, if you want to talk about, I presume the thing here is about the FBI and the United States, the long arm of the FBI going around the world. Absolutely. I mean, you know, you've got to be very careful where you go nowadays if you're on a particular American watch list, because you might go to a country which you've got no problem with, and you could find yourself very quickly in prison, in that country, detained because the Americans want you, and then very quickly you could find yourself on a plane headed for the United States. And there's quite a few nationals of various countries, especially Russia again, who find themselves in exactly that situation. So Montenegro is not, Montenegro has a government which at the moment is reasonably friendly with Russia, but it's still very much part of the Western system. Certainly not a place which, if you're fleeing from the FBI, I would advise you to go to.
Yeah. Hey Man says, so much of European history is actually about getting preferable trade routes to India and China. With Russian help, the pre-opium war world order is back.
Well, indeed, yeah. Absolutely. Well, yes. Can I just also say, I mean, of course, if you wanted to open routes to trade with Asia, the Russians are working very hard on their Northern Sea route, which could conceivably reduce times for sending freight to Europe very, very considerably. I mean, they've been developing this huge fleet of Arctic nuclear-powered icebreakers, and it's now becoming viable. You could actually send, load up your ship, send it from Japan or South Korea, of course, China, up along Russia's northern coastline, and you could cut your times considerably. It's not happening yet on any very huge scale, but in a sane world, it would happen. World at the moment isn't entirely sane.
Yeah. Rafael Lingonda says, salute guys, good job and thank you. Much love. Thank you very much, Rafael, for that super chat. And the fix is in. Sent us a $5 super chat. Thank you very much. The fix is in. Rit says, fashion industry is a very little part of Italian exports. Their main exports are car, machinery, energy equipment, ships, railways, etc. Britain's Virgin Rail are Pendolino made in Italy.
Absolutely. But can I just say the point about the fashion industry is that it may not be a big part of your exports, but it is a very big part of your image, of your brand.
Brand Italy.
and
big
that's
part,
yeah. And you can't underestimate the importance of that. Russia actually makes lots of things, but it's got no brand. There's no, if Russia were into fashion, it would be very good for Russia because that would establish its brand. And at the moment, they haven't got that. Italy does, and wow, it has.
Yeah, that's true. Peter says Xi like Schwab economics, but Putin doesn't. But Putin somehow likes Xi. What do you think of this?
Yeah, I think I've discussed this. I think Xi and the Chinese's approach to globalism and the Klaus Schwab thing was ultimately manipulative. And by the way, I think it's now biting them, actually. I think that they've now started to understand that getting this close to Schwab and Davos and globalism, all the philosophies and theories that go with that, has actually opened them up to criticism from all sorts of people. So I think they're gradually, slowly edging, tiptoeing away from that position. Putin's never liked it. I mean, he's always been against it right from the get-go.
Yeah. Divine Insurgent says, I saw your stream with Black Pigeon Speaks. He said the Chinese are more like a merchant nation. Perhaps many of the Southern Chinese are, but Northern Chinese tend to be more patriotic. Many military classics come from China, including The Art of War.
Well, yes, I think I think in fairness to Black Pigeon, his point was not that this has been true throughout Chinese history. What he was saying is that this has been true in China for a very long time, but not always throughout history. I mean, The Art of War was written during the period of the Warring States, which is about 400 BC. That's a very, very, very long time ago. And obviously, at that time, Chinese society was aristocratic and warrior. It was a warrior culture. If you read Chinese culture at that time, know your Chinese history. And it continued to be very much that way for a lot of Chinese history, right up perhaps to the fall of the Tang dynasty in about 700 AD. Thereafter, China became a much more, shall we say, sedentary merchant commercial society. And I think that is the point that Black Pigeon was making. So it's not perhaps the best time to discuss Chinese history. And, you know, I accept that there is still a martial tradition. I think that perhaps Black Pigeon is underestimating the vigor of the Chinese military today. I think one should be careful about making some of the comparisons that he was making. But I think, as I say, in fairness to him, he wasn't talking about the whole of Chinese history, but about its more recent past, recent being a relative term in terms of China, because its history is so long.
Yeah. Raphael says, so Russia cataloged every airplane, every boat you have in the Black Sea, cities and time they took off. Are you going to win?
No, of course you're not going to win. I mean, it's a good, excellent point. By the way, I've been talking about Russians being able to keep track of all of these things. I mean, I watched a program on Russian television some time ago, which they showed they could keep track on every single satellite and artificial object. They have the means to do that in space, that's circling the Earth. So of course they can track things on the Black Sea. It's just ludicrous to think they can't. This is a sea that adjoins their own territories, and of course, if Russian warships and Chinese warships were to do the same sort of things in the Gulf of Mexico or off the west coast of the United States would rightly, by the way, be very anxious and annoyed about it. And it's strange that people in Washington just don't seem to want to accept that.
Yeah. They have Crimea is like a massive aircraft carrier sitting in the Black Sea. I mean, you're not going to win.
No.
Period.
Of course not. Of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. And I mean, and of course the logistics and the Russians can redeploy troops to that part of the world from any part of their vast country at extraordinary speed. I mean, just look at the geography. All you have to do is look at the map and you see who's going to win. It's inevitable.
Okay. Sekajugu says, what is China's goal with replica of U.S. military ships and planes in the desert, training its AI?
Well, exactly. I think that's exactly what it's doing. And it does tell you a few things because, of course, the Chinese obviously want the United States to know about this because, as I said, they're doing it in the desert. They know that the United States can track these satellites, can track these things with their satellites. So the Chinese want the US to know that they're training to do this very thing. The second is that they are training to do this very thing, which shows that the Chinese are now preparing for a possible conflict with the United States in the Pacific. And that's a very ominous development. That should make us extremely concerned.
Too Small says, what do you say about the MSM on steering the international policy of a country?
Well, it's a disastrous thing. That's not the job of the MSM at all. Anyway, the MSM is there to report it and comment on it and explain it. They don't do that anymore. Look at how many editorials now appear in places like the New York Times or the Washington Post or, God help us, the Guardian, the Times, the Financial Times. And they say that Russia must do so and so. Belarus must do so and so. Lukashenko must, do X, Y, Z. It is. That's not their job. That's not what they're there for. Then they're not in a position. They shouldn't be trying to exercise that kind of power, and yet they do. And they can. And of course, if you allow the policies of great nations to be run by editors of newspapers, well, you're in serious trouble because those editors don't have the kind of access to the information and are not responsible for the kind of decisions that governments must take.
Flying Boar says, you think Hungary and Poland will ban BLM?
I don't know.
I don't know how active they are. I don't think that's very active.
No, I wouldn't have thought so. Exactly. In that.
I was in Poland. I didn't hear much about that, to be quite honest.
No.
Interesting question. Let's see here. Pardip Sangha says, how strong is the Russian economy? Is it underestimated?
Yes, I think it is massively underestimated, but this is a huge subject. Straightforwardly and very simply, there are two ways of looking at it. Or at least there's more than one way of looking at it. Firstly, you can take nominal GDP. You take the ruble, you convert the ruble into dollars, and then you add up all the prices and assets and all the rest in Russia, and you come up with a price in dollars, and that's quite small. And that's the figure you usually see, and that's the basis of people saying that Russia has an economy the size of, Texas or Italy or Montenegro or the Galapagos Islands or whatever. You base it all on exchange rates. The second is that you do what the World Bank and the IMF prefer to do, which is apply purchasing power parity. You take the ruble, you convert it, you look at what you can actually buy with rubles in Russia itself. You then do essentially the same GDP calculation, but you do it using purchasing power parity basis, and then you arrive at a completely different figure. And then at that point, Russia becomes either the fifth or the sixth biggest economy, probably the fifth actually, because it's probably bigger than Germany at the moment. So that's another way. the third thing, and I know that this isn't just my view. There's lots of people who in the academic world who say that, which is you say that even these figures are wrong because, of course, you can't just compare prices in Russia with those in the West and even do it on a purchasing power parity basis. Because, for example, prices of houses, prices of stocks, those sort of things are extremely cheap in Russia by comparison with the West. And the value of Russian companies, partly because of sanctions, partly because of all kinds of things, is completely out of sync, if in Western terms, with their overall scale of operations. So if you factor that in, you arrive again at a completely different figure, and then the Russian economy turns out much bigger again. And at that point, I know that there are some people, I'm not going to name them, that would embarrass anybody, who think that it's about the same size as the economy of Japan.
Yeah. Flying Boar says Hungarian and Polish fans booed in the English football players for kneeling for BLM. What do you think of that? Okay, so that's connected to the BLM question.
Well, there we are. Yeah.
Well, I think it just shows that Hungarian and Poland really don't like that stuff. I guess they're just not into that stuff.
No. Well, exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, interesting. Let's see. Margarita Shan says, I'm hearing all about the Tempest this weekend, Alexander. What on this Golden Globe was Shakespeare smoking all that day?
Well, Tempest is an extraordinary play, very bizarre. By the way, just for those who haven't watched it and don't know, it all happens on an island where all sorts of magical things happen. And there's a curious figure who's perhaps a magician, perhaps not, Prospero. Most people believe that the island in question, at least those who try to relate Shakespeare to geography, is the Greek island of Corfu. And the people in Corfu take that very seriously, and you can go on Tempest tours there. I personally don't take that hugely seriously, but there's quite a few people who say that. Anyway, regardless, I think it's an extraordinary play. It is a great play. It's a very strange, very complex play. It's one of those plays that Shakespeare was writing very much at the end of his work as a playwright. It's immensely rich. It's got very complex ideas and language and philosophical thinking. And it's a play that has been massively written about. Now, to do a critical analysis of it on a live stream is impossible. All I would say is that it deals with all sorts of issues like the conflict between civilization and, if you like, barbarism. It looks at relations between society and the fact that people are social beings. It has strong ethical conceptions. It's got so much in it that it's difficult to really summarize it. It's one of his most difficult plays, but one of his most wonderful.
Yeah, Ronald says the Tempest is actually a study of different philosophies of government.
Yeah,
so
it's many things.
It's many things. Works on many levels. Rich says Italy is an export machine and real competitor to German industries. They compete in the same fields of machinery, cars, etc. They do compete on many.
They do compete, absolutely. And in Britain, there are some people who buy German cars, and there's some people who buy Italian cars, and they are the same sort of, shall we say, attractiveness. But it's interesting that they appeal to somewhat different segments. The sort of people who go for German cars and the people who go for Italian cars have slightly different outlooks on things. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right. We got all the questions. We covered a ton of ground. Alexander, let me just make sure I got everything here. And I think I did. Thank you to our moderators. Let's see. Zariel, Valies, Alan Watson, Reckless Abandon. I think Cosmic Rain, I think, was in here. Of course, the great Spartan warrior Queen is in the house. And who else? I think that's everybody. Did I miss anybody that was moderating? I don't think so. I think I got everybody. Thank you very much to all the super chats and to everyone in locals and your questions there as well. We had a bunch of people on the locals chat as well with great questions. Hey Man has just dropped a super chat which says, you can annex Canada with funny stories and bad ideas, but that won't work in the Middle East, Asia, or Russia. As the Spartans said, you will have to come and take them.
Quite true. That's a brilliant point. Yeah.
Great way to end the stream. Hey, man. All right, Alexander, any final words? Any final thoughts as we enter the weekend? It was a busy news week.
It was a very, very busy news week. And of course, it shows how active the world is. Can I just, because we just had a point about Shakespeare, I remember I had an issue with some American person who bought into all kinds of things. He was talking about Shakespeare, and he was trying to insist to me that Russia is a very new country and that the Russian Empire hadn't actually existed, and this is a fiction, and all those sort of things. And so there you go. You go to Shakespeare, and Hermione, who is of course one of the characters in The Winter's Tale, she says that she announces herself to be the daughter of the Emperor of Russia. And that proved instantly that, of course, the Russian Empire did exist in the early 17th century when Shakespeare was writing. And Hermione is a positive figure. And at that time, relations between Britain and Russia were extremely good. So perhaps we can look back to the time of Shakespeare, to the time when Britain's America, well, it didn't exist then, but the colonies were starting to be established. They didn't have this phobia of Russia that they do today.
Well, let's end the stream with a super chat from Basha, which asks about the great Tony Blair. Blair Institute posts
from
Shakespeare to Blair.
From the sublime to the ridiculous. But anyway, carry on.
Blair Institute boasts it has people embedded in governments around the world. Is this legal or democratic?
Well, it's not democratic. Whether it's legal or not, I'm not sure. But it's certainly not democratic. And I mean, Blair is, in my opinion, of all the people in the world, I mean, Trudeau is the political leader today who most raises my hackles. But even he, I mean, not to the extent that Blair used to and still does. I mean, I can't be measured about Blair. He so infuriates me. I'm going to say it straightforwardly, and I consider him, and I don't think this is just me. I consider him an incredibly sinister figure, and that he should be involved in that kind of way around the world is just, well, both unsurprising and typical given who he is, but unbelievably dangerous too, given the kind of man he is.
When has Blair ever cared about whether something is legal or democratic?
No, of course not. Of course not. That is absolutely right. Certainly, he doesn't care about democracy. Legality. Well, all you have to do is watch a film called Official Secrets, which is all about how he doesn't appear in it, but about the run up to the Iraq War, and about the kind of things that he was doing, and about how one of his darkest secrets was exposed by Catherine Gunn, the great whistleblower who now supports Julian Assange.
Yeah, someone that Blair does not support.
No,
that's for sure.
But I mean, it showed. I mean, when Catherine Gunn was prosecuted, she was brought before the court, and her lawyers wanted to obtain documents. They subpoenaed for documents about the kind of thing that the Blair government had been up to. Documents they knew existed and which established the illegality of its practices. And because, of course, the Blair government couldn't risk that, they dropped the prosecution. So that tells you how little respect Blair has for law.
Yeah.
Even though he's a lawyer himself.
All right. Let's end it there on that note. 10 more likes to get to 1,000. Come on, everybody. Hit that like if you haven't liked this stream. Just hit that like and let's get to 1,000. And let's close out this live stream on a positive note, because of all that Blair talk kind of, makes me feel unclean, Alexander.
Absolutely.
All right,
Absolutely.
two more likes, and we're there. Let's get there. All right, 1,060. Oh wow, super! Thank you everybody for a fantastic live stream. Have a great weekend. Thank you once again to all our moderators. Thank you to everyone that sent us questions via Super Chat. Thank you to the great community at Locals, the Duran.locals.com. Please go there and you will catch Alexander live every Wednesday, and a lot of other great videos and content is also there, the Duran.locals.com. Duran shop, Alexander, 10% off. Use the code Real News. I have my UK magic mug here. Since we're talking about Blair, Will. All right. You have the hat as well. I think I've got Switzerland. It's my Swiss.
Well, since we've been talking about Italy, I've got Italy.
Is that Italy or Hungary, though? Someone said that it's Hungary.
Oh, so it might be Hungary, actually. Yeah,
I think it's Hungary. Yeah,
I'm afraid yeah, excellent. Well, Hungary then.
Hungary, the great Orban. All right. Take care, everybody.